Okay, I'm going to talk about the differences between the ESFP and the ISFP, specifically how they differ in their tertiary function. Okay, so the ISFP has tertiary introverted intuition. And before I talk about tertiary introverted intuition in the ISFP, I want to talk about the tertiary function generally and the introverted intuition function generally. Introverted intuition is sort of notoriously hard to understand, and I can see about 3 reasons for this. Number 1 is that the products of introverted intuition, especially introverted intuitive dominance, like the INJs, is going to be something that is very abstract and is going to be something that's pretty difficult to understand. So, for example, Plato, the INFJ, his theory of forms is pretty difficult to understand, or at least pretty out there conceptually. Hegel, the Hegelian dialectic, is very notoriously even, obscure and opaque, according to some people. And Hegel himself admits that his thinking is something that is not easily prepared for the mob, and it is something that is by nature pretty esoteric. So that's one reason for people's difficulty understanding introverted intuition. Another reason, and I'm not limiting myself to 3 reasons here, but I've been able to identify 3 in this case. Another reason that introverted intuition is difficult to understand is that introverted intuitives themselves have a difficulty explaining their thought processes. It doesn't have this ease of expression like extroverted intuition does, because the introverted intuitive is attempting to more draw something out, and this drawing out is much more laborious than the sort of just cognizant and aware nature of extroverted intuition. So the products of introverted intuition are pretty difficult to understand, and introverted intuitives themselves, not counting the INPs, just to make myself clear, but INJs have difficulty at understanding themselves, their thought processes. Then there's the fact that the NJ types, the INFJ, INTJ, ENTJ, ENFJ, are supposedly, according to all the stats I've seen, the rarest of all the types. So there's all this stuff going against introverted intuition's ease in understanding. So then, to make matters worse, I think the tertiary function is also pretty difficult to understand. The tertiary function, I think, is difficult to understand for the reason that people take a somewhat codified and sort of they want something more empirical out of Jung's typology, and I think that is why there's been a huge influx, as far as I've seen in the communities, of socionics, because socionics gives this allure of empiricism, and it seems very mathematical, and they say stuff like the dominant function does this, the creative function does this, the hidden agenda function does this, the vulnerable function does this, and it's all very concrete and not very dynamic in its own system. In their intertype relationships, they have a sort of a dynamic there, but even then it's sort of concretized. So that's one reason that people have gone to socionics. But I think more psychodynamic approach to the tertiary function. I don't want to say Jungian, because Jung didn't, as far as I know, talk about the tertiary function a whole lot, or even name it. I'm not sure. But a more psychodynamic approach to the tertiary function might view it as something that is subject to more conscious interplay. So, for example, I view the tertiary function as sort of a third flavor and as something that can be slightly anathema to the overall heuristics of the dominant and auxiliary functions. So, for example, ESTPs are always... I've seen a lot of quotes about ESTPs that say, you know, he could be as sweet and as caring and as engaged as a bedside nurse, or he could be as cruel and distant and mean as as a you know, psychopath or whatever. And so this is something really interesting to me about the tertiary function, is that it has that interplay of being this thing that helps extroverted sensation and introverted thinking as sort of, you know, their an extra flavor, and differentiates the STP types and all of the sister types. And it's something that I've really enjoyed doing about these videos. But then it also is retracted from the psyche and becomes this anathema again to the overall heuristics of the NTPs or the STPs or the NFJs or what have you. And so this is an idea that's gone into on a Celebrity Types article called "The Puerile Nature of the Tertiary Function," and so they compare it to and John Beebe compares it to the child archetype. John Beebe is another guy who has an 8-function model, if you're not aware of who he is. He compares it to the child archetype, the tertiary function, because it's like this fresh thing who has no real preconceptions about how things work, and so can be used very originally. So, for example, the ENTP using extroverted feeling to get people on his side, get people on his page, on the same page as him, in something as sort of anti-extroverted feeling as debate. So it has that fresh quality. But what the child archetype doesn't achieve is ever sort of, maybe you'd call it a self-actualization. It's never fully fulfilled. It always comes back to its initial stage, and so you have an excellent comparison of extroverted feeling in the ESTP going out, being this, you know, fresh young thing, and then being burned by the sun that needs to come back in and be the perennial repeater of the process or whatever. So yeah. So now I will actually talk about the ISFP's introverted intuition, which is very interesting to me. So introverted intuition, as I define it, or as I've seen it argued, is this sort of meta-representative, impressionistic, archetypal view of reality, and you can see that I definitely don't have it because I'm just sort of splooshing words as my definition of introverted intuition instead of getting it down to one perspective. But we see this meta-representative kind of thing in Plato, where he's talking about the forms, which are sort of the idyllic representation of objects. That's what's more real to the introverted intuitive than the object itself. So in the ISFP, we can see it in Leni Riefenstahl, who, according to Celebrity Types, is an ISFP, and was apparently a Nazi filmmaker. And so she has this really cool quote: I seek a style in the realm of legend, something that might allow me to give free rein to my juvenile sense of romanticism and the beautiful image. It's especially cool that she uses the word juvenile there, because comparing it to, you know, the puerile function, the puerile juvenile stuff, it's all very nice tie-in. But she's talking about a style in the realm of legend, this sort of archetypal thing that you can see the essence of. One of the words that I've liked to describe introverted intuition is that it sees the essence of something. And in that essence, they have that vision, and it becomes sort of this grand overarching thing. So the ISFP has that sort of representative, impressionistic aspect to them, and a lot of the times the ISFP is going to want to capture this, and this is something that Michael Pierce talks about in his video on the ISFP, his first video. He's going to be redoing them, but yeah, it talks about capturing that beautiful image, the impression that is more real to the INJ than the actual object, and expressing it through some sort of usually aesthetic means. An aesthetic not being limited to art or painting or music or whatever. It could also be extended to just a way of being and stuff like that. So in the ESFP, introverted intuition is repressed instead of tertiary. So the ESFP does not have this sort of representative quality to them, where they're looking at the impressions of what they're seeing. Instead, they have a much more direct approach to life. So to quote ESFP Benito Mussolini, he says something along the lines, the reality of experience is far more eloquent than all the theories and philosophies on the tongues and on all the shelves. So his view of introverted intuition, probably wasn't aware of it, but is that this sort of focusing on the impression and the essence of things distracts from achieving, as Jung says, I think, the highest pitch of actuality. And he's much more focused on the photographic picture rather than the impressionistic display of that picture, display and association of that picture. So, along with achieving the sort of direct view with reality, direct relationship with reality in the extroverted sensor in the ESFP, this also gives them much better focus on, as Boy Akinwande says, the ever-changing object. He talks about that in his article, Why Taylor Swift is an ESFP. And so another quote from Mussolini sums up this focus on the ever-changing object quite nicely. My political evolution has been the product of a constant expansion, of a flow from springs always nearer to the realities of living life and always further away from the rigid structures of sociological theorists. So I found that quite interesting, just their ability to focus on real things that are happening in real time and their evolution instead of the introverted intuitive attitude of it all staying in your head and being quite cerebral. So in the ESFP, TE is tertiary. Similar to the ENFP, this gives them that sort of enterprising, jovial quality of yes, let's do that. But instead of having a sort of ideological modification, as I talked about in the ENFP and the INFP, I found that in the ESFP and the ISFP, their difference in extroverted thinking is quite comes down to an ability to engage with reality. The ISFP has that introverted intuition, which is very, as I've talked about in my NE versus NI video, which is can be very withdrawn from reality. Of course, they're somewhat in their dream world, as Jackie Onessa says, but they don't fully actualize introverted intuition. You hear someone like Bob Dylan say, you can't be wise and in love at the same time. And this sounds sort of anathema to the intellectual aspect of introverted intuition. So, just giving an example of that interplay between third flavor and somewhat anathema. So likewise, in the ISFP's introverted intuition being somewhat making them withdrawn from reality, extroverted thinking, their repressed extroverted thinking, makes them, sort of gives them an Achilles heel when it comes to making effectual decisions. There was psychologist Stephen J. Rubinzer, who talks about multiple presidents, and he talks about the ISFP president, Ulysses S. Grant. And he says that his personality was a very poor match for the presidency, the worst president of any president thus far. But of course, in the ISFP, this also allows them to live and let live. That's something that's been said a lot about introverted feeling. And the ISFP Prince says, not just about letting others live, but being allowed to reach a state where you're able to live freely is another aspect of having extroverted thinking repressed and introverted feeling dominant. So Prince says, the ISFP says, I don't live in a prison. I'm not afraid of anything. I haven't built up any walls around myself. So you see that aspect of not being restricted by any sort of demands, very similar to the INFP, and not limiting yourself. Not limiting yourself from being, the best you can be, or the freest you can be. But back to the ESFP and his extroverted thinking. I talked about how it's not quite as ideological as the ENFP. It's more to do with having that reality connection and the extroverted sensation, but also being able to act on reality. Is what I see in the extroverted sensation and extroverted thinking combo in the ESFP. So to illustrate, this investor Mark Cuban is supposedly an ESFP, and he has this nice quote: "To succeed in business, you have to put yourself in a position where if luck strikes, you can see the opportunity and take advantage of it." So we see him talking about having an awareness of circumstances, the extroverted sensation, perceiving the ever-changing object, but also the ability to make effective decisions, which is a facet of extroverted thinking and its ability to look at all the moving parts, seeing how they interact, and creating an idea that's going to have the best effect. So that's the ESFP versus the ISFP. Sorry that this was longer than the other ones, but I wanted to talk sort of generally about introverted intuition and about the tertiary function. See ya, whenever.